I have to say, it's really inspiring to be here. We have so much to offer in Boston, and I want to thank Jody for creating the One Harvard, which is obviously what the iLab is all about. But I also want to thank Boston, too, because this is really also about the One Boston. And I think we have a community of entrepreneurs here which deserves the recognition of what's coming to the fore and the great ideas that are coming up in the iLab. So thank you, Jody. Thank you, the iLab, and thank you to Boston. I appreciate you being here this morning. So with that, we have a fun agenda today. We're going to do something which I think we now pride ourselves on, which is find a way to bring to life the startup secrets. And the particular thing we're going to talk about today is entrepreneurship. And that's a subject that is near and dear to Andy Jassy's heart. For those of you who don't really have an appreciation for this, I hope by the end of today's agenda, by both having an overview of what Andy's done, me spending some time to talk about that with him, and then bringing up a panel of actually cloud startups who've literally hatched in the cloud, we can give you a sense of how this is literally changing our world. But I also want to get behind this a little bit because I was lucky enough to get to know Andy, and I was struck by this cover when I saw it. That the person who was on the cover here is, of course, Jeff Bezos. And he's being held up as the one taking the risky bet. But I actually think the guy who was taking the risky bet was Andy. If you look beneath what was going on here, it was Andy's vision and forethought that, as I talked to people inside Amazon and the many other companies that have been relying on it, brought this to life. And so sometimes we don't always see the heroes sung in the appropriate way, but today hopefully you'll get to see what it takes to actually build something inside what was already a giant organization and to make a real impact. So I'll tell you something at a personal level that you may not know about Andy. The first thing that struck me about him when our first conversation started up is we didn't talk about Amazon. We went straight into culture. We had a fantastic conversation about how he was thinking about the culture of the AWS organization, how he was hiring, how the approach to building that was really the foundation of his business. And that just really struck me. And as you know, it's one of the core foundational pieces that we talk about in Startup Secrets, and I'll mention it briefly today. But it was just a great conversation. And in those kind of conversations, you realize very quickly why great organizations get built around that kind of leadership. So welcome, Andy. It's an absolute delight to have you here today. We have a lot of fun with you. We're also going to be joined by a few local startups, and some of these are literally just getting going, such as, for example, Localytics, and others like Demandware. Full disclosure, one of my portfolio companies is now a public company. So we've got the full range of startups that have started in the cloud, mostly on Amazon, and unfortunately a couple didn't have the choice of Amazon when we started, like Demandware. So it'll be fun to have that discussion and to get into play some of the realities of how this has changed. So my first role is to do the wrap-up for a mere 40 hours of programming in a mere 20 minutes. So this should be fun. We'll jump right in. The Startup Secrets program is designed as a series of workshops. And initially, I first committed to doing this. I was thinking, oh, I'll probably do a couple of hours here. And of course, as now you've met the charming Jody, you realize that we all get charmed into doing 2 that turns into 20, but we'll have more fun than we thought. So this program has expanded, and we're doing everything from starting with sort of an outline of what the perfect pitch would be if you were going out to raise money, merely as a framework, really, to give people a sense of what needs to be put together in a business plan. And then we start with some core things like building the value proposition, and then, as I was talking about, a foundational element of culture, how you do your hiring, then disruptive business models, how do you actually make an impact beyond just the product and technology, and then how do you take it to market, both strategically with things like branding, as well as tactics around, for example, building your sales cycle. And 2 new things came to the fore. We are continuously listening to the students. So this year, there were 2 things we heard loud and clear. There are a lot of people in the challenge teams who are product-oriented, innovators who are developing products. And they want to understand, how do they design a product so that it can be built into a company? So we created a new session this year. It was widely attended. We had some fantastic examples. I'll give you a couple of cases on it today. And then finally, everybody obviously wants to understand, how do you get this funded? So that workshop was also excellent. I'll give you a couple of cases from that. So that's my first 4 minutes. Now let's zip through and give you a sense of what this program is all about. So in the Getting Behind the Perfect Pitch, for those of you who have a chance to come and see this or want to see it online, all this is available on the iLab sites or on my site itself. And you'll find that mjskok.com or iLab moniker anywhere you want to pick up on this. The idea here was exactly this, getting behind the perfect pitch. It wasn't to try to teach you how to do a presentation. It's what is a VC or a funding organization like an accelerator program thinking about when you're making your pitch? And what should you be doing to relate to them? So the first thing I did was to tell a story. And why is that important? Because In fact, all of this hangs together when somebody tells a story. My story was, in fact, about me getting lost on the Great Wall of China. So we had a lot of fun figuring out how the hell I'd managed to do that when it's one wall going one direction. But trust me, VCs are pretty bluntly dumb like that. So that was the story I told. What I encouraged the entrepreneurs to do was tell a different story. It was to make sure that you had a very clear example of why you stood out. And so one of the first things I'd like to share with you as a startup secret is a lot of entrepreneurs come to us and they say, we have to have all the answers. That's just too hard. You know, we've got to have everything from our financials together to a great product plan. We don't know how to go to market. That's not true. I'm happy to have an entrepreneur actually who we're literally just funding as of this week. And he, I'm sure, would be the first to say, we don't have all the answers. In fact, we probably have more questions than we have answers. And that's actually an appropriate way to come to building your perfect pitch, to be very self-aware, to be completely clear about what you don't know and where you need help. That's actually a more helpful place for us to be able to fund you. And then to have one thing that stands out. And it's more important to have one really compelling advantage. For example, it might be that your team has uniquely been solving this problem for the last decade, as in the case of the company that I'm funding today. They are uniquely experienced to do that. And everything else we can build around. We can build how we support them in terms of a business model or what might be the right funding for them. But because they are a clear standout, they are uniquely suited to solving, in this case, a very big problem, it's a perfect place for us to start. So I think the one thing I'd want you to take away, if you missed the entire class, this is the Cliff Notes. Come with one thing that really stands out, be self-aware about the rest, and we'll help you figure it out. So that was that class. Fun this, huh? You get an hour and 2 minutes. Now you know how little substance there was in all of my workshops. The next one we talk about is the compelling value proposition. This is one of the most important things because what we typically hear when we're seeing entrepreneurs is fantastic ideas. And there are so many great ideas in the world, and everybody always asks the same question. If I have a great idea, does that mean I've got a great company? Well, it could be. But in general, there's a big gap between having a great idea and building the beginning of what's really a starting point, and that's the value proposition. So we spend a bunch of time talking about what's the difference between an idea and a value proposition. How do you actually get something to a place where it's genuinely compelling? It's a must-have, not a nice-to-have. And so one of the things I'm just going to pick out here is a small case example of a company that we brought to bear. And by the way, the whole value of these workshops is not me talking, it's the case examples like Andy we've got today who come in and share this with us. So in that vein, I'm going to introduce you to Matt Johnson, who is a CMO of one of our local organizations, UTest, and let him tell you a story of how they challenged themselves to build a compelling value proposition. So I'm going to ask the UTest guys to, again, just give us a sense of this. You guys obviously have a clear gain. In fact, we probably don't need to go through that in too much detail. But can you highlight what the pain was for your customers to adopt this? Because you were very honest about this. Thanks.
Yeah, there is pain involved in the world of software testing. When we're doing our job well, it's a bad news business. And that means we are reporting 40, 50, 60 bugs on the latest version of your iPhone app or the latest version of your Kindle Fire app or your website. And it's not just a clean matter where we report the bugs and you say, okay, poof, they're fixed. We're actually creating work for the CTO's organization. There has to be somebody who has to actually go and review these and reproduce these bugs. So there's increased overhead, not just for the QA department, but we're actually creating work for the engineering department. Now they realize how many things are actually broken in the wild, and that's great for users. That's lousy for the Fumis of the world. The second thing that happens is they might be good at managing their 5-person QA team. They might be good at managing one outsourced vendor in Bangalore. But in the original iteration of UTest, you had just inherited 35 testers from 14 different time zones. And there was a lot of collaboration that was required between the in-house team and the crowd-based team. And so I think we've realized that early on, and we've taken a lot of steps to decrease that pain. The original business plan, correct me if I'm wrong, Duran, didn't include a professional services layer. Now we actually have a 20-person team that can do work remotely for clients, that can actually go on site, and is actually a revenue center for us. But their job is to make sure that the overhead is what you want it to be. Some clients actually want to be very involved with the testers. Other clients don't want anything to do with it. They want us to actually gift wrap it and say, these are the 12 things that you should fix tomorrow. And ultimately our goal that we've come to in the last 12 to 18 months is we need to maximize the in-the-wild testing that we can do and minimize the incremental overhead. And it was only when we realized that it wasn't just about maximizing gain, it was about minimizing pain, that things really started to fall into place for us.
So this is an example of a case where what was brought to light, and you can find all this online with the full case example, is something that we see many startups completely fail to even think about, which is you may have an incredibly great gain associated with, in this case, doing testing on a crowdsourced basis in the wild over the web. You could save people money, you could save them time, you could introduce, for example, ways to give them competitive advantage because they get products to market faster. You can do many things like this. But there are two things that people forget. What's the pain the customer has to go through to adopt your solution? And it's incredibly important you focus on this, because not only is there a pain in, as a startup, being found and being tried, being bought, implemented, but on an ongoing basis to be owned and managed. And in UTest's case, one of the things they discovered, and that's what they were mentioning, is that they just hadn't even thought through any of that. For example, they hadn't realized that they would introduce a completely different workflow that would introduce problems in the way that the bugs were not reported, but actually then ingested into the system and actually fixed. And so they're causing people more pain rather than actually giving them a gain, because they were introducing bugs that people didn't understand, they didn't have any context for them, the workflow of them was much faster, they all came at once, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, when they got into things like implementation, they realized they needed a professional services organization. So this is the kind of thing that we try to bring out in these workshops, is what is it that you've got to think about? Now, the other thing we point out is that as a startup, the reason this is so important is that there is a huge amount of inertia associated with your startup being a risk for any company to work with. And so although people don't say it, if there's good enough, that's what will be good enough. They will not take a bet on you. In fact, the default is to do nothing. And so you have to get over this inertia. And we point out the obvious, which is in order to do that, you've got to have a gain-pain ratio of at least greater than 10, at least an order of magnitude impact, so that somebody says it's worth taking the risk on this startup. And so that's a little bit of the workshop in a nutshell for you. Again, you get the 2-minute version. So the next piece that we go on to is the piece that I most enjoyed in my chats with Andy, which was talking about how do you build an enduring company? And there's many elements to this, but we reduced it down to 2 fundamental pieces: culture and hiring. And so just to give you a sense of that, what we talk about is this picture of how you may have a great value proposition now, and you may have a great vision, you may even be able to execute flawlessly, maybe you hire incredibly well, but underlying that is culture. And so we brought in another of my companies, Acquia, which actually has the joyous record today of being the fastest growing startup in the software world in America, #1 in the Inc. 500. And we had them talk about how do they do that? How did they become the fastest growing company? So here to tell you a little bit about that is our CEO, Tom.
That acronym is PIII. And it's something we look for in every candidate who is hired in the company. And it starts with passion, P for passion. And we want people who are really, love it. I had a conversation with one of our people on our engineering team last week, and I asked him, he's been with us a year, I said, how's work going? He said, work? I looked at him kind of funny. He said, yeah, work. He said, I don't work. He said, I come here because I love it. And that's an important thing about passion. And for the sake of time, I won't go through details on the other 3, but they stand for, in order, intelligence, integrity, and initiative. And it's about intelligence, not raw intelligence, but doing the right thing, doing the smart thing, using common sense. Integrity, because by all means, we need to do that with ourselves, with our peers, with our customers, and with our partners. And initiative, we want people who, we have another saying for that, of course, which is ask for forgiveness rather than permission. And we live that each and every day. So that's how we define culture. We use an acronym. It makes it easier, and we can talk about it as a company as a result. So.
Just felt like the right place, right time, amazing opportunity.
I looked at the vision for Drupal and I said, this is the future, and I want to be part of that.
So we're hiring like crazy, and it's a real challenge.
The challenge of growing is making sure that we continue to communicate, we continue to find new great people.
And so one of the things that Tom did so well was to bring out the obvious here, which is that actually culture is not an accident. It comes from the top, and we've seen this over and over again. The people who lead establish the culture early on. So in a startup, that means you are the culture from day one. And it takes deliberate effort to actually establish what I put as the one thing that I hope never changes in your business, and that's your culture. Your values and your principles and your guiding beliefs should be there early. And the earlier you establish them, the more likely you are to have that touchstone that everybody can come back to that will keep a consistent foundation for the business. And when we see really high growth companies, that is there. It's a core piece of this. And so we'll have a chance to talk to Andy and see how he feels about that. A second thing we did, which I'm not going to go through today because it ended up being a whole nother workshop, and we've split it out into a new one, is to talk about hiring. So next semester, I'm happy to say we'll have a specific workshop on hiring. It was one of the most popular articles that I wrote. It's on the site. Had over 20,000 views within the first few weeks. So it was obviously, I touched a soft spot there. And so we've broken it down into a new workshop, and we'll go into it next year and talk about how do you get A+ people and what's the basis behind that. So that's going to be some fun. We then came on to talking about one of the biggest areas of all, which is going to market. So now you've got a great value proposition, you've built your culture, you've hired some great people, and you're hopefully taking this thing to market in some form as a product or service. So how do you do that? Well, I was very open with everybody, and I'm going to be open with you too. This is way too big a subject to cover in 1 or 2 sessions. So we just picked out a few key things. We picked out the very core strategies at the beginning, such as branding and positioning, and then whether you go to market direct or indirect. And then we picked up a few tactics, like, for example, how do you target people and what are the kinds of personas and actors that you have to deal with throughout. And then we went very full on into a tactical understanding of what's the kind of sales cycle or go-to-market cycle that you might want to deal with, and we put a framework out there for that. So as I said, it's a big subject, but we have some great case examples up on the site. I'm just going to pick out 2 to give you a sense of this. We had, first of all, Mark Lorien, who came to us from Spotfire. Mark was the CMO at Spotfire, for those of you who don't know, a very successful local Boston company that got acquired by Tibco, where he went on to be CMO with them in that group there. And Mark gave us a view of how he believes that it's actually incredibly important, even though it's a big area, to actually get everything on one page. So let's just have Mark take us through that.
There's value in thinking through your go-to-market strategy and summarizing it in one slide. So if you think about the topics that Michael was hitting on, the actors, who are we going after? What segment are they in? What is the very specific audience? This play card that I'm showing you is a 1-slide summary of how Spotfire went to market to reach risk professionals in the financial services industry with our analytics product. On the left-hand side, you're basically defining who are we trying to reach, what keeps them up at night, what's the core message that helps differentiate our offering, and what's the competitive advantage that we bring distinctly over the next best competitor. So it's essentially mapping out the market strategy or the go-to-market strategy. On the right-hand side, we'd force our teams to come up with the tactical details to pull that off cross-functionally. So that this wasn't a marketing-led initiative, but you'd get, even as a small company, get people from different domains around the organization, share with them the objectives of what you're trying to do, what are the accelerators and the brakes and the clutches for your business, help people in the organization understand what you're trying to do, and you'd be surprised what creative ideas come. You know, getting these great ideas from the pre-sales group or the engineering group because they've got an idea of a clutch that, you know, that we can help address by bringing and building it into some of the go-to-market plan.
So the great thing about this class, so you know, is that it's full of people with great opinions. And so last year we heard a ton of input from people about, yeah, that's the old school of doing things. What about this new inbound world? Doesn't the web change everything? So we had a really good discussion about that. We talked about how it actually does. You can now have everything as a closed loop, and it's possible to do almost everything in a virtual way, whether it's seminars or webinars, etc. But we also talked about what are some of the realities of this? Does this really scale? Does this work for really large organizations as they get going? And the answer is yes, in some ways. But there are some negatives. One-click away competitors, for example. Everybody can be compared instantly. And the reality that you still can't forget the personal touch, that in the early stages of building your brand, for example, that customer experience is everything. And so maybe you can do all that on the web, but don't take it for granted. But to just make sure that we had that balance, we had one of the leading, again, Boston firms, HubSpot, and our CEO, Brian Halligan, come in and give us his view of why the world is changing. And if he has his way, everything will be changed by HubSpot.
And what happens is you create an asset today, create a piece of content today, and it's an asset that lasts forever and scales forever. It pulls in customers, and it lasts forever, and it pulls in customers essentially forever. So it's not like you're renting that asset. You own this asset. You're not renting space on Google. You're not renting space in some lists. You're not renting space on Facebook. You're creating your own marketing assets to become magnets that pull customers in. Okay, the other thing I like about inbound marketing versus outbound marketing is people hate outbound marketing. Does anyone like getting called at home at 6 o'clock? Does anyone like getting spam? Anyone like those television ads? Sucks. Inbound marketing is great. You create all this content, and it's rich content, it's informative, and it pulls people in, and it's engaging. So people fall in love with your brand like they fall in love with Patagonia, or they fall in love with Apple, or they fall in love with Whole Foods, these brands that people love. That's you want to create a lovable, modern brand. People are really sick of this traditional marketing.
So in case you didn't get his viewpoint, people are sick of that old stuff. But this is what's great about these workshops is we had people with tremendous passion sharing why they believe things are changing and how they could help you reframe things as a startup. Now, one of the things that I've tried very carefully to do is to make sure there's a balance between technology and business in the workshops. And one of the areas that's been least understood, we found, is in the disruption potential of a business model. We really feel that one of the most important things you can do as a startup is actually to come and rewrite the rules, change the game, create a new basis on which to take your business to market. I'm happy to say that there are plenty of great examples of this in our portfolio and in and around the startups. But we kept being challenged to find something really big. Somebody said, so what's a really big example of this? Where has this made a huge impact on a, sort of a global scale? And so we decided we'd go to Google and ask them. And we got Google to tell us the story of Google Apps.
Google Apps versus Microsoft Office. Office is the dominant product. It's hard to imagine now, but 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it was Office. If you did Microsoft Word, Microsoft Office, Microsoft Excel, PowerPoint, they dominated. There was no competition at all. So how do you compete with a competitor that has 90% of the market, 100% of the market? Well, first thing is, don't compete head on. And I'll get into what that means in a minute, but that seems obvious, right? Don't compete head on. You're going to lose. So don't do that. Microsoft Office was the enterprise market. Okay, everyone in business used Microsoft Office. So what did Google Apps do? Went in the opposite direction. And said, let's start with consumers. Let's start with home users. Don't compete head on in the enterprise. We'll lose. So they started in a different position. Free, that's always great. Free versus paying $500 for Microsoft Office. So that's a way to compete. And is Microsoft going to come down to free? No, they aren't.
So we spent a bunch of time also looking at one of the more interesting battles that's going on very much now, because this one of free versus obviously premium is an example of a disruptive business model. And the business model obviously Google has is not selling software. It's figuring out how to sell advertising based on information. And that was a big enough disruption to basically leave Microsoft with a huge innovator's dilemma. For those of you who haven't read that book, it just meant that they simply couldn't come back and compete with that because they would have had to have given up billions of dollars of revenue and profit to compete with free. Not going to do that. So that's one of the reasons why business model is so important. And right now is, of course, the raging battle between Android that Google has got with a very open ecosystem and iOS with a very closed ecosystem, but a very large one. And so this is a subject that I think we'll have a lot more discussions on. I'm looking forward for more cases if anybody wants to bring them forward. Because one of the things that's changed since I was an entrepreneur, dating myself back 30 plus years ago, there weren't more than 2 or 3 business models. But today, we see innovative business models continuously coming to the fore that we think are going to be a big part of the disruption for entrepreneurs to take forward. So as I said, there was a new session this year, asked particularly by the iLab and people here, for the many people who are product innovators, who are the designers, the entrepreneurs, if you like, creating some of this innovation. How would they turn their companies into, their products into companies? So we took a little different approach here. I went to seek this far and wide. First of all, we decided we'd do 2 case studies. And we'd do something that I'd been asked a lot, which is to bring somebody in who was bold enough to talk about the challenges and the failings and failures of their own particular startup. And so we were incredibly grateful to Greg Favalora to come in and do that. By the way, this whole themed area was 3D, because 3D was such a big innovation. And Greg is going to tell you a little bit about how he went about trying to build something creative and innovative. And then we brought in John McElhaney, who's one of our multi-time successful entrepreneurs and CEOs, who built a company for us called SolidWorks that has become one of the most successful, both large 3D CAD/CAM companies and then ultimately a multi-$100 million business inside Dassault. So it's interesting, and I'm going to take you through the stages of this one to see how this played out. It was a bit of fun. First of all, we had Greg talking about his invention.
Created this device that looked like a crystal ball. For scale, I show it there in the corner with a Sharpie pen. It would create imagery that looks like a hologram, about the size of a basketball, or actually about the size of a head. And it would create floating 3D images that you could see without having to wear those glasses that you wear at the movie theater and see it from any point of view all the way around.
Now, what do you think the audience's reaction to that was? I mean, this is just amazing. This guy created the world's first 3D display. You could literally walk around the image of somebody's brain and see it as though it was literally right in front of you. Must be a huge opportunity, right? Who else agrees with that? I mean, I thought it was a huge opportunity. Is everybody asleep this morning? There's at least a couple of people who are bold entrepreneurs here. Well, here's what happened. He obviously spent a lot of time trying to commercialize this. And some 12 years later, this was nothing more than a patent sale. Why? I mean, when you've got such a brilliant innovation, what happened here and what could we learn from that? And he was bold enough to share some of that with us. So this is his overarching lesson.
The overarching lesson is that even if you have an awesome product, you really do need to deeply understand at least one market where warm-blooded, actual human customers will write you actual checks that you can cash in a bank. And you need enough money, more than you think you need, especially if you're working on hardware, to make the thing so that it really works well. It always takes more than you thought.
Now, we went into a lot more detail than that, obviously, with Greg, and you can find all that on the website. But we boiled it down to one acronym. For those of you who know me, you'll have heard me say this many times before. I was a terrible student. Actually, what am I saying was? I still am a terrible student. So I learn everything by acronyms. And so this is the acronym. It's trying to come up with friction-free, slippery products that are simple, low to no initial cost, install easily, prove value quickly, play well with others, can be easy to use right out of the box, prove their value in an ROI sense, and that ultimately becomes so sticky that your customers can't live without them. Now, trust me, not everything fits into a slippery product acronym, but if you do those things, and we have many case examples of this, you will have a product that's on its way to getting ahead of the competition and being in a place to build a business around. And so we took a whole bunch of cases around each of these points. If you want to find them on the website, you will do that. But this is a big subject. And it was funny. When I got questions afterwards on the web, this was one of the biggest questions, which was, OK, but Greg talked about markets. What's the market challenge here? How do we get that product market fit? So we took this one level deeper.
If you're going to go waste a whole ton of money on engineering, make sure you don't just know the names of markets or the workflow of those market segments. Understand who would be writing you a check, why they would make money from writing you a check, and so on and so forth. Really map the living heck out of this flow of money.
So I still got a bunch of questions. I got more and more questions. I ended up going over to London to do a workshop with Seed Camp because they were like all over me about, we've got 6 startups who are struggling with the product market fit. Help us. What is our challenge? So let me break it down for you. We have heard over and over again about the great things about the lean startup approach. We love that approach. But it starts with this concept of a minimum viable product. And that's a wonderful thing, except it's in isolation to the most important thing that you've got to figure out with it, which is, well, where does it fit in the market? And so what I find happens is a really, really simple thing. People go out and they start to approach their marketplace in a very broad sense. They say, maybe they pick a vertical. They might be smart to do that. And so we're going after financial services because they're early adopters. Financial services is tons of different markets. Is it insurance? Is it banking? Is it retail? I could go on. Now, if you quickly find that you're trying to serve a couple of customers in different places, what's going to happen to your product? It's going to end up with banking needs, insurance needs, retail needs. It's going to not be a minimum viable product. It's going to be a minimal bloated product. And it's really very tough for startups at that point with limited resources to stay focused. And so I introduced a new term, which is basically the minimum viable segment. And let me take you through that. What we're doing here is we're saying, let's find the segment where we can have one set of needs that is the same. So I don't even care if it's in the same vertical. I care that the needs are identical and that the problem and the pain set that you're addressing is identical. That becomes a segment where every time your product is used, it fits that need over and over again. You do not have to change your product to meet that need. That's repeatable. That becomes something that a business can build on. So in simple terms, if you've got a minimum viable product and you can address a minimum viable segment, you can get repeatability. And you can repeat it for the same needs, for the same requirements, and obviously then get what I would describe as a minimum repeatable product. And that is what I see missing more than anything else when we see early stage startups struggling in their go-to-market. So we hope that this becomes a basis for people to pick up on, and we've seen a lot of great feedback on it. I've written an article which will go fresh up this week for one of the publications. And so there'll be a full text on this because there's been so much question about it. We then came on to the successful case study that proves this point. And he proved it beautifully. And that was John McElhaney, the CEO now of one of our other startups, Belmont, which is in stealth, so I can't say much about it. But he talked about his previous experience building SolidWorks, as I said, what became the leading CAD/CAM system in the 3D world over many years. And he said, what do you think this one set of numbers means? And his whole entire point here is going to be revealed in 90 seconds.
I remember a guy coming to me from Detroit and saying, I have a really good friend inside of Ford. He runs powertrain. And I know we can work with their data. I want to go sell them. Would you come out and visit with him? And I said, I hope you don't mind, while you're selling at Ford, if we had 2 other resellers in your backyard to go focus on the opportunities that you're not going to be focusing on. He wanted that upper left quadrant. Big opportunity. Well, guess what happens with the guy at Ford? They bring him in, and they love it. People want validation. They love it. This guy's selling, saying, this is awesome. The guy at Ford wants to buy our product. So he spends a little bit more time showing it to him, and the guy inside of Ford and powertrain says, you know what? Our guys love it. The guys actually in styling, they want to see it as well. So can you come back next week and show them product again? And all of a sudden the sales cycle, instead of 2 months and 3 months, starts being 4, 5, 6 months. And the guys are like, well, we got to get some business closed. And they said, the good news is people really, really love it. And you know what we want to do? We want to do a pilot. We want to go ahead and buy your product. But instead of buying 60 seats, guess what? They ended up buying 3. So what we wanted people to focus on is 1 to 5 seats, 0 to 3 months.
So the 1 to 5 seats, 0 to 3 months, was the entire focus of the go-to-market in that company. And John went on to explain that everybody, from the exec team to every dealer in the field, understood that methodology. And it brought me to say, one of the things that I got asked a lot is, what is my number 1 startup secret? It's a very encompassing secret, but it is all the same thing. Don't be afraid to focus. The number 1 thing I see with startups is that they are desperately seeking to become something huge, and that gets in the way of them actually picking where they start in an effective way, whether it's with a product or a segment or a go-to-market or a business model, something that they can do to prove. And if you take away nothing else from today than the following, which is, how would you like to build your business? Would you like to grow based on your success, or would you have to contract based on your failure? Unfortunately, 95% of the failure we see is the latter. People started too big, too broad, boiling the ocean, and they weren't willing to take the disciplined action to get super focused on all of the different pieces of what we've been talking about today and build up on success. So if you take away nothing else today other than that and get a chance to look at all the case studies, they all build on the same thought. And they help build what has been a constant question I get all the time from entrepreneurs, which is this balance between vision and execution. And I'm a big believer in vision. I think vision is incredibly important. That's how do you go after something meaningful, impactful, build something big. But you've got to start with execution that's realistic and very focused around what can you do right now that makes an impact. So I see Andy nodding, which is a good thing, because if you didn't, I'd be in a lot of trouble. we'd be starting off in the wrong place. And then our last workshop, which again was new this year, was the funding strategies to go the distance. And this again was a detailed workshop, but I'm going to boil it down to something we talked about, which is there are really only 2 great times to raise capital. And I'm sure you're going to argue with this, but having been an entrepreneur and raised 100 million myself, these are the 2 really great times. You've either got all the potential in the world, or you've got all the proof in the world. Those 2 times are a great way to raise capital. So to bring that to life, we brought in the founder of Endeca, Steve Papa, who has the right to an opinion here, having started a company that became, in Boston at least, a recent legend with an outcome of over $1 billion. So here we are. First of all, with all the potential, Steve Papa.
So the company was started just a few hundred yards from here, over in Hamilton Hall. And in fact, there's the first version of our product in my dorm room at Hamilton. That's the version 0.001 of our database that Oracle ended up buying. So with that in mind, how many people here were in their professional careers in '99? Show of hands. There's a few, and so everyone, those folks with their hands raised know how crazy it was then. right? And this chart kind of exemplifies why it was so crazy. So venture capital as an industry, kind of 4 to 5 billion a year being put into funds, right? Which are, which is, it means about that much being put to work on a steady state, all the way to, over 100 billion in 2000, okay? So what that means is lots of money is being shoved out there in Series A's, right? So that makes it pretty easy, right? In fact, when we were founded, it was there. It took me 3 days to get the original angel financing. Actually, I had several venture firms. Actually, one of my professors over at school ultimately invested as the third one in that angel round. And by the end of the year, we had a great, Series A financing, and we were off to the races.
All sounds great. Now, what happens when you don't have all the proof and you have to go out there and raise money? Well, let's have a listen to what he had to deal with when he had one customer and still needed to go out and get this A round.
Unfortunately, while we're looking for customer number 2, we're on the other side of this macro private equity situation, or venture situation more specifically. What you'll see is, the amount of capital raised, declined to about 1/3. So that means all those companies that were funded the year before, now, they're, and a lot of stuff Michael talked about was sort of this idea of 18 months. Then, the different set of rules people were operating under. So everyone's looking for capital. So if you thought those thousands of business plans were tough, try standing out when everyone's trying to, triage their own portfolio, and you're trying to find capital, right? And your existing investors, right? They're really reticent to lead an internal round because they don't want to set price. It sets problems with their limited partners. There's a whole set of cascading things. So you're kind of out on your own, okay? That doesn't mean we didn't get help and introductions. I spoke to just about every venture firm, that I could identify over the course of 9 months, right? And, the other challenge that was happening while we were needing funding, originally I had a goal of finding some customers that were going to help us fund this and stretch our runway, okay? But this was the first year-over-year decline in IT spending ever, okay? So this is an industry for 40 years. Spending's going up and up. New companies, I got discretionary money to spend on new things. All of a sudden, it declined. So all the discretionary stuff was gone. And this was one of my, one of the quotes that was very painful. I'd run into people and say, I spent $8 million last year trying to solve this problem. It didn't work, but you solve it. But I don't have any money to spend with you, okay? So very painful, okay? We built a great product, great technology, yet the world had changed. Like the rug had been pulled out from under us. The initial inspiration for our technology was solving a business problem in e-commerce. And this goes to one of the things about the investment community. It swings like a pendulum, right? And it's not always rational, okay? So for instance, in 2001, what we were told, e-commerce was dead. Can't make any money in e-commerce software. And we all know how laughable that is, but that's what I dealt with, talking to person after person.
I can't help but enjoy that last statement, e-commerce is dead. So not only do we have Amazon here to talk about that today, but actually the public company I was mentioning earlier in our portfolio, Demando, we funded in 2002, and Wayne, one of the founders here, is going to join us later on today. So this is another point that comes out of these things, is we learn incredibly obvious things. I'd never even thought about it until Steve got up here, but the macro environment's a super important piece of this background. Obviously, as he was explaining, in the bubble, anybody could raise capital. In the Series A cliff, I wonder how many of these seeds will get funded. These are the real things we have to think about. So a big thanks to Steve for sharing that with us. And I'll skip that particular piece, basically him sharing his joy of how he actually got the $1 billion outcome. But he was also very quick to say he closed it in 60 days because he learned that nothing good ever happens while you wait, which is a famous quote of one of my partners. So I'm going to wrap up now and just simply say a very, very big thank you to the dozens and dozens of contributors to the case studies. All these case examples, the people who came in and gave their time, they put in a tremendous amount of effort. There's a rapidly growing group of case studies on the site. You can find them there. Just go to the Startup Secrets on mjskok.com and look for case examples. And they're all the real substance of what we've been talking about today. So a big thank you to everybody who participated in it. And thanks to everybody for the ongoing support. We will be starting the workshops again next semester. They've been broken out. They've added 2. So we're going to start with the set that I talked about this morning, but breaking out culture and hiring because they're such big subjects. And then carrying on to the following term, we've added one new workshop, which was by popular demand, which is understanding who are you? Are you a real entrepreneur? Have you got what it takes? or should you pair up with somebody? Are you a founder, or are you a CEO? And so we're going to spend some real time on that, because we'll spend a bunch of time in the iLab here understanding that's a question people need to just wrestle with. And then, as I said, we'll carry through the rest of the series. And we did a pitch competition, for those of you here, a couple of years ago, and we really started this off, and it was extremely popular. We didn't have time for it this last year. People sort of berated me for that, so we're going to do it again this year. Actually, I did one at Amazon's event, and it seems like everybody loves these, so we'll find a way to do that. So I just want to wrap up by saying a very big thank you to the iLab, to all the support that we've had here, everybody from Jody and Neil and Gordon himself, to all the staff here, and to all of the audience. I mean, we've had a sellout audience. Every workshop today is obviously not a student audience, but most people have been on exams. But it's been a fantastic group, and we really appreciate it. So thank you all very, very much indeed. So I'd now like to welcome Andy to the stage. As I said to you, Andy is somebody who probably needs no introduction to those of you who are using his products and services. But if you don't know of it, Amazon Web Services has really become the de facto platform that's defined the cloud computing world. So I couldn't be more excited to have him here. Last time I saw him, he was standing in front of an audience of no less than 6,000 developers at the reInvent conference. And that shows you something of the momentum he's built. I not only have, as you know, I'm a big evangelist of cloud itself, and you should have in your chair actually a sticker, which is the Future of Cloud Computing survey, endorsed not only by Amazon, but now by over 50 collaborators. It's by far and away the widest survey in the industry. So we have everybody from Amazon to Microsoft to the smaller players like Eucalyptus. Many of you in the audience are collaborating on it. But this will be the third year where we'll be collating the results of this phenomenal change. But it was led by Amazon. And Andy, welcome to the stage, and please join us to tell us a little bit about your story and the Amazon piece. Great to have you here. The fun part about this story is that Andy is himself, of course, an HBS grad. So it's great to have you back here.
It's fun to be here.
And it's hard to believe that in 7 years you've done all that. But let's wind the clock back a little bit and talk a little bit about what was the inspiration for AWS and how did it get going?
Yeah. Well, there were a few things going on, I would say, in the 2000 to 2003 timeframe that led us ultimately to deciding to pursue it. The first thing was that we were doing an assessment ourselves as a senior leadership team about what Amazon was really good at. And initially, you can imagine what we were talking about. We were good at retail. We were good at detail pages on our retail site. All the things that were the primary business at that time. But as we dug deeper, we realized we were really good at running these infrastructure services deep in the stack. And then we were also really good at running these reliable, scalable, cost-effective data centers. So the first realization we had was that we actually had a real core competence in running infrastructure. The second thing around that time that was happening was we started doing these very large partner deals on the e-commerce side that we called merchant.com, where we do these deals with Target or Toys R Us or Marks and Spencer, where all of their website was powered by Amazon technology. And when we went to deliver the solution to Target, which was really the first big one that used all of our technology that way, that was on their website, it was much harder than any of us thought it would be. And that's because in the first 10 years of Amazon, we had entangled a bunch of pieces of our platform that we wished we hadn't. And so in disentangling that and providing that to Target, we really got religion in the company about building in a service-oriented architecture fashion, very loosely coupled. And it really permeated all of the teams, such that we had goals for the teams that they had to have well-documented APIs that were hardened so that each of the internal teams inside Amazon could use those respective services to build applications.
Right.
That was a real cultural shift. I think the third thing was I was working in 2002 and 2003. Amazon was growing really fast. We were adding a lot of engineers, and software projects were taking us much longer than we anticipated. And at the time, I was working for Jeff Bezos as his, what we called his shadow at the time, and it was really like a chief of staff role. And he asked me if I'd try to help figure out what was going on. And when I would talk to product development leaders, they'd say, look, I know you guys think these projects should take 2 to 3 months end to end, but I'm spending 2 to 3 months just on the storage solution, or just on the database solution, or just on the compute solution. And what they were building didn't scale beyond their own project. And they knew that multiple people on other projects were doing the same thing. And that was a very interesting realization for us, that there was all this reinvention of the wheel inside Amazon, and there was this real thirst for infrastructure services. And I think if we had never built AWS and opened it externally, that we would have built all these services just to allow Amazon, the retailer, to move more quickly. And then the fourth thing was, we have this associates business, which is part of our retail business, which allows third-party websites to merchandise Amazon retail products, and if it leads to a sale, they earn about a 5% commission. And that team was trying to figure out how to be more ubiquitous across the million associate websites they had. And they tried several tests. And one of the tests they tried was, they just took all the product data, the product title, the pricing, the availability, et cetera. They put all that in an API. And they thought if they could decouple the data from the presentation, that associates would do more with the data than we had time to or would think of. And that led to much better conversion for those that used it. But what really surprised us was, with no promotion, thousands of developers flocked to these APIs. And they used them for things we didn't necessarily anticipate them using them for. And they asked us to open up all kinds of parts of our platform that we hadn't really contemplated. And so all those things came together really in mid-2003, and we took this step back and we said, well, if you believe that developers and businesses will build applications from scratch on top of these web services, which people call the cloud now, then the operating system becomes the internet, which was a really different model than before. And then we said, well, okay, if you can believe there's going to be an internet operating system, what are the key components, what's been built, and what will we be good at contributing to? And when we looked at that in mid-2003, none of the key elements of that internet operating system had been built yet. And when we thought about what we were good at, and Amazon's always been a technology company at its heart, one that applied it to retail first, but always a technology company, we realized we could contribute many of those pieces of that internet operating system. And with that, we decided to pursue this much broader mission, which was to enable developers and businesses to be able to use these web services to build any sophisticated, scalable application they wanted.
You know what's fantastic about listening to you is that you probably just gave us 7 case examples right there. So I'll try to draw out some of them for the benefit of the class. One of the things that's really interesting is it's very clear from day one you were trying to solve a real problem. I mean, you obviously identified initially with some customers that you were trying to service, and then it sounded like it morphed into, well, internally you were struggling to meet those needs, and it sounds like you dug deep to try and understand why, and what was the set of challenges for your internal developers, and so that pain and need became real.
Yep.
And then you did something else, which we talk about in our product classes and in our business model classes, which is that you created an internal customer for yourself, which sounds so dead on. We talk about eating your own cooking and co-creation.
Drinking your own champagne.
Actually, that's a much better way of saying it, because in my case, the cooking is definitely not good. So I'm in for the champagne. That sounds a lot better to me. So I love all those lessons, but there must have also been some point at which somebody had an insight to start to think about this external possibility. And that's always something entrepreneurs are very keen to know about. What was the insight, and how did that moment happen?
Yeah, it really wasn't. I can tell you the moment, but it's not dramatic.
Yeah.
In the same way that I often feel that you had very gracious things to say about me in the introduction, and I appreciate that. But I always feel like any one person who's associated with it gets too much credit. It's always a lot of conversations and a team that's thinking it through, and then all the best ideas don't matter if you can't execute, and that's really a team effort. But I think that we were starting to think about this as a way to move faster internally, and we had a meeting. There were probably about 6 or 7 of us in the room, and at a certain point, I don't even remember who said it. One of us said, well, we're pretty good at this. We have a really strong technology team inside Amazon, and if we're having so many problems with this, and we don't have anything we can use externally, I imagine lots of other companies probably have the same problem. And that was a time actually it was in mid-2003, and it was a time also when I was moving out of the shadow role I was in to the next role I was going to think about. And Jeff had kind of tasked me with finding my own role. and which is interesting to do. And as we had that realization that we thought that external companies would find this very compelling as well, I decided I would try and write a business plan and a proposal about it. And so that's really how it happened. And I don't know if others find this, but I found that I had a certain belief about it that was interesting and intriguing to me, but I became much more excited about it as I wrote the plan.
Right.
Because as you do more research, as you talk to more customers internally, it's super helpful inside a company to have a lot of customers who are demanding, who will give you, opinions and tell you what's wrong. And as I talked to some of some of the external folks who were using the associates business, who were more technical, who I thought might use these services, you just got the sense that it was a real need and that they didn't like the existing business model and choices they had. And the more that we kind of wrote the plan, the more we thought this could be really compelling.
And so what's interesting about listening to that is that obviously you took a bold move to write that plan, but like all good entrepreneurs, you didn't just assume it was a plan you could execute from. You went and validated it. So how much did you balance the internal validation of your own engineers versus going out and getting out of the building and figuring out who really was going to get into this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that we did both, but there's no question we did more internal validation than external validation because it was just easier access. Once we wrote the plan and we got excited about it, and then we started really talking to a lot of customers about it, potential customers about it, we felt like we were sitting on this secret. And we weren't really sure it was a secret, but we felt like it was a secret.
Yeah.
And we really didn't want to let anybody know we were working on it because we were probably not at that time the most obvious provider to do it. And we really felt like to be successful, we had to be a first mover.
Yeah.
And so we fortunately have a lot of, we have hundreds of development teams inside of Amazon who were very happy to talk to us. We did something different, which was at times very frustrating, but ultimately very fruitful, which was we took 10 of our best technology minds and 10 of our best product management minds, and we locked ourselves in a room for about a week, and we went through about 10 applications, some of which were the biggest internet applications out there, and some of which were applications we thought should exist but didn't. And when we tried to decompose them and say, well, what would you need if you were actually going to build these from scratch on top of these services?
Yep.
And what was really helpful about that was that it helped us refine which were the first ones we should build, because the same ones kept coming. It turns out everybody needs compute, and it turns out everybody needs storage, and it turns out almost everybody needs a database. So that was very helpful as well. So we did both. We were very careful externally to pick people that we knew and trusted, and that also we thought would give us honest and thoughtful feedback.
So now I want to step back a little bit, because one of our first conversations, which was so much fun at this point, was you obviously started to create something of a business unit inside of Amazon. So you were really being an entrepreneur in the true sense of that word. What were some of the guiding principles that you established? I mean, it came across so clearly in your introduction that there's some very strong culture at Amazon, and things like putting the customer at the center and then thinking about value and really trying to differentiate around that and low cost and so forth. But as you started thinking about AWS, did you just take that forward, or did you decide there were some other cultural principles to add to?
I would say that largely we took the Amazon culture and leadership principles and applied them here, and we made sure we executed them well. But there were some differences. But first I'll start with the Amazon. Amazon has a very strong culture. I think most companies that are successful, the culture matters a lot.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
And so we have 14 leadership principles that everybody at the company knows. It's how we performance review everybody. And I would say that the thing that new people who join Amazon often tell me is the most surprising is just how much everybody lives to those leadership principles.
Yep. And it's that consistency.
There is, and you hear them very consistently from Jeff all the way down. And so I heard some of them in some of the videos that you showed earlier.
Yeah.
But so a lot of those applied. Everything we do starts with the customer and moves backwards from there. We're very long-term oriented in Amazon. We're careful about which things we choose to bet on, but the things we bet on, we don't expect them to pay back in 12 to 18 months, and if they don't, stop.
Yep.
We think we're planting seeds that will become trees in 5 to 7 years down the road. We have very aggressive milestones and goals, every step along the way.
I'm
But we
smiling,
really-
by the way, because this is sort of the number one thing we always talk about, is if you're going to start a company, it takes 5 to 7 years.
Yeah.
So for you to be saying that, even as Amazon, is just music to our ears here.
Well, you do have to have that patience because if you're doing something big and new, you don't know how
Absolutely.
the customers are going to respond to it.
Yeah.
And so, we were very customer focused. We were long-term oriented. We were trying to build a business that where we built long-term customer relationships and weren't just optimizing for any short-term piece. And then, we wanted people who were very passionate. We wanted people who were hungry and ambitious. We wanted people who had a very high bias for action, because we feel, any startup, I think, really needs to move fast. If you
Absolutely.
move slow, and you're going to miss the opportunity. We wanted high judgment people. We wanted people with really high standards, and that's a really important cultural and leadership value inside of Amazon. The way we write the leadership principle is that you have high standards, almost unreasonably so.
Yeah.
And I think that as a leader of whether it's a startup or a larger business, if you don't set the right expectations about what the standards should be, the people you hire won't have them, and as you get larger, the people they hire and those people
Absolutely.
hire, just all of a sudden you find that you don't have the right standards inside the organization. So that was very important as well. And we actually also wanted a mix of people who had deep technology experience and infrastructure experience, but we also wanted people who weren't pickled already. In the beginning of doing this business, we had one of my very, very best, most senior technology people who's super smart and has turned out to be unbelievably helpful and important in our business. But I used to spend like an hour therapy session almost in the early days trying to make sure that he and the rest of the team really believed, because it was a much easier path, as this person used to argue, for us to just do the e-commerce APIs I mentioned that were like the associates business. And the reasoning was very sound. That's what we know. That's what we're good at.
Yeah.
Are people going to ever buy storage from us? Are people ever going to buy compute from us? Are people going to ever buy database from us? And those were very real concerns. But you want people who believe it's possible and believe you can change the world and see it from a different vantage point to be mixed with the people who have a lot of that deep experience inside the industry. So that's what we were looking for.
Again, it's great if I could just draw out a couple of things for the class and make sure that I haven't missed anything that you communicated there. But it's obvious you developed a framework from the existing culture to bring forward that was still consistent. So it obviously didn't miss some of the core values. But then you also said some key things. I mean, you realized that this was a vision you had that was not proven. I mean, it couldn't be. Nobody had even thought of it. And we often talk about this. You have to have that vision. It's so important to establishing the premise to get people excited. And another thing you said here, which we talk a lot about in the hiring session, is it's great to have experience, knowledge, and skills, but sometimes it gets in the way. It actually is great to get the fresh out of school kids who basically don't know what's not possible, and therefore try everything.
Yep.
And that combination is such a wonderful combination. I don't know whether that sort of mirrors your
that's right.
experience. So what did you do in terms of hiring? Did you decide you'd only recruit internally, or did you go external too to create this?
Well, I remember when we made our ask for the initial team to the senior leadership team, we asked for 57 people, and I felt like that was one of the ballsiest asks I'd ever made. I was really scared about making that ask.
Don't come to the VCs and ask for 57 at day one, by the way.
It was, for really just an idea on a piece of paper at that point. At Amazon, we don't do PowerPoint presentations. It's part of why I'm so primitive with a lot of my PowerPoint presentations. Everything, all the communication, all the meetings are narratives, and 6-page max. And so I had written this vision document and then asked for this 57 people, and we were really we felt really strongly that we should either build a platform with multiple services like this, or we shouldn't do it. Because there was some debate there that said, well, why don't you just build S3 and see if that works, and then if it works, then you can talk about getting more resources to build other products, and which, by the way, is a completely rational approach and line of thinking. But we really felt strongly that just one storage service, when you want to provide an infrastructure platform, wouldn't be enough, and it would take too long after having that and proving that it was successful to build the second service that would provide an opportunity for somebody to move faster and catch up faster. So that's why we asked for that number of people. And to Amazon's credit and to Jeff's credit, he really didn't bat an eyelash. He they believed in the potential of it long term, and we pursued it. And if you're going to hire 57 people, it's pretty hard if you're going to grab good people who are usually gainfully employed and the company's growing like that to take 57 internal people. So we took as many good internal people as we could do without hurting the business, but the vast majority of them ended up being external people that we hired.
And as you brought them in, I mean, that vision obviously was a key part of it, but what were some of the other things that you were looking for in those early hires? What were some of the attributes or things that you used to make those hiring decisions?
A lot of the same things I mentioned earlier. I think that there were some people that we were looking for certain experience sets that were useful in our space. But I would say, we wanted people who were smart. We wanted people who were really analytical. We wanted people who had high standards. We wanted people who were both passionate and optimistic that they could change the world, because we knew what we were going to do was hard.
Yeah.
And we knew that you had to believe, and we knew it would take some time to actually build the services. And so we wanted people who would stick it out and really, be excited to stay the course. I'd say that we also we wanted people who were tenacious. We screened for tenacity. We talk about that a lot in our hiring debriefs because, again, it's hard to get something going. And inside the company, even though I think Amazon was unbelievably gracious to AWS, there were some people who didn't believe inside the rest of the company, and who in the early days didn't move fast to help us move fast. And you needed people who were not going to allow themselves to be victims.
Right.
So we wanted people who were tenacious. And then we wanted, we wanted entrepreneurial people. Sometimes when you get to a company who's grown to a certain size, you get too many people in that company who are content to move slow and don't feel this constant closing window. And we didn't want those people. We wanted people who were really hungry to build something new and who felt real urgency. We liked people who had been at startups or startups inside of companies that hadn't worked, but who were self-aware about what hadn't worked and what they could have done better and what they learned from it. And then one of the things that's most important to me, and that I really believe is one of the differentiating features of people at all levels and how fast they move, is whether they're really good learners.
Yeah,
and I think that people that think they have figured it all out just don't learn at the pace that you need to. And we have a belief inside Amazon that all of our businesses, even our retail business, which we've been at the longest, is in the really early stages. And people, I think, mistakenly assume that game is mature and done. It's really
still in
very
single
early.
digits of penetration.
Right, and so, I mean, it's a big market, and you're right, it's single-digit penetration. And if you don't believe you have a lot to learn, and you're not self-aware and hungry to learn, you're going to very quickly find yourself no longer relevant. And so we wanted people who didn't feel like they'd figured it out, and now we're just applying it to this. We wanted people who felt like they were going to continually learn.
It's funny, I'm fond of saying that the older I get, the more I realize I have to learn, because you get more aware of what you just don't know. Right. But that self-awareness is another characteristic we talk a lot about, and I think it makes a big difference.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, that's a great intro. So now you've got your vision, and you obviously have sold that internally. You kind of raised your, if you like, internal capital to do that. You've gone out, you started hiring your team. How did you start to formulate at that point the core of the value proposition?
Well, we had, in proposing the business, we had some theories. And so we really went and tried to validate it as much as we could internally and discreetly externally. And, we found a bunch of things that seemed to resonate for people. Inside Amazon, they would have told you the most important thing was to be able to be unblocked, move faster, autonomous. They cared about cost. They wanted the cost to be, at least as good as what they had. But inside Amazon, they just felt like they were moving so much slower than they wanted to. And to the external world, I think they were probably moving fast, but there is this perpetual angst inside Amazon of moving faster. So that was very interesting, and it helped us think about the fact that even though we knew over time we'd want to build abstractions further up that made it much easier to use, a lot of the development teams that were going to do anything at scale wanted APIs.
Yep.
And they wanted to basically build services that programmatically consume those APIs.
Yep.
So that was very helpful in having us start
So you
at the API level.
And you really started using the internal custom to validate that very
They were
clearly.
all using our services before anybody else. We had, kind of interestingly, as a matter of historic fact, the very first external beta user for EC2, which is our compute service, was Paul Moritz. Paul was running this small startup called Pi, which eventually got bought by EMC, and Paul and his team were incredibly helpful in helping us understand which things worked in EC2 the way we originally envisioned it and which things didn't. And so, that's what we really did. We heard over and over again from customers that, especially external customers, that they really hated this model of you had to, you basically had to commit to 3 years. You had to commit to a certain amount. You never really knew how much to commit to. You had to provision for the peak, and then if it turned out you didn't use the peak, there was all this breakage, and they just felt ripped off. And
so the core was really this elasticity right from the get-go.
Elasticity was one of the things that we realized quickly could differentiate. So that was another piece that really mattered. We heard over and over again, internally and externally, that they wish they didn't have to manage their own infrastructure. People would say things like, it would be great if I didn't have to do that and you could do that. And we couldn't tell, sometimes you never know when people say that if they really will do it, or whether they're just saying that and then you have it and then
you got to get a check from them.
Yeah, so right, like one of the entrepreneurs was saying. And
exactly.
So we would ask questions, like how much would you pay for something like that? And they wouldn't give an answer, and we'd be persistent about trying to get a ballpark, and we got a sense pretty quickly that we could provide it a lot less expensively than what they were paying. So that was encouraging to us, that we thought we could be disruptive pricing wise. So those were some of the things that came together quickly as we were building out the services. And then you build, like everybody, you build some of the ways that you're going to market the services.
Well, you say like everybody, but it's not that obvious to some people. So let's talk a little bit about that in a moment. But there was obviously a core set of things you started to validate. And it sounds like, again, just listening to you earlier as you were talking about AWS, that there's a core cultural belief that you really should innovate quickly and test and validate quickly, which is a key thing that all startups need to do. So can you talk a little bit about how you started to do that while you were trying to be in stealth mode? That must be quite interesting.
How we started to
how did you get the external validation to...
Well, we picked the external customers we picked people that we felt like we knew well. It's funny in retrospect with Paul, because he's gone on to work at companies that compete with us, but Paul was good friends with the original team that built EC2 was a development center in Cape Town, South Africa. Paul is South African, and one of the guys who was senior on that team had a relationship with Paul. So we knew Paul and trusted Paul. And so we just picked people that we thought were highly technical. Would you consume these services that we could trust to not, disclose the information? And then they were really gracious with their time in us pestering them to some degree on what they wanted, and then trying our various private betas and prototypes and things of that sort. And you have, again, I've seen teams that ask for the feedback and don't really listen to it, which seems crazy. But it's not intentional a lot of times. I think it's that sometimes you have such a strong vision, and it's hard to hear that vision needs to be adjusted. It's painful, and it's time consuming, and it's going to take longer, and you really do have to try and hear what people are saying and be willing to adjust. And so again, that's a good cultural piece of Amazon, which is we really listen carefully to customers, and we try to ask questions that we don't just accept the first thing we hear. We ask further questions to see if that's what they really meant, or did they mean more something like this. And so that's really how we did it, trying to be, at the same time, trying to build teams and iterate quick.
We said a couple of very important things there. This vision concept is not one that's held up on high. It's really just an opportunity to understand the marketplace. So we often try to talk in the classes about how do you build a vision for the market. not just about your product or service, because otherwise you get, as you say, locked in too quickly. And in fact, what you really want to do is get the validation coming back to find out whether anything is really going to resonate with that customer. And
Yep.
that's the starting point for something to become obviously meaningful.
Yep.
So as you started to do that, as you mentioned, you started to formulate the go-to-market. So can you talk a little bit about how you thought about that initially? Did you think it was immediately going to be something you would just direct sell? Were you going to just evangelize it from the developers?
Yeah, I'm going to answer that one sec, but one other thing on the last topic
Yeah,
I think might be interesting is, but it was also very helpful for us in not getting too locked into our vision, was that we have this way that we do product development at Amazon, which is that the first thing we do is we write a press release and an FAQ.
Right.
Before we write any lines of code, that's the first thing we do. And the press release is intended to, it's supposed to be a real press release, and it's intended to make sure that the benefits that you're articulating actually matter and are meaningful. And we use that with customers so that they can see what we're saying the value proposition is, to see if they say, that's awesome, or if they say, okay. And then the FAQ is to be the how of how we're going to build the service, how it's going to work, what architecture is going to be underneath, what features will exist, et cetera. And that's really intended for us to flesh out what the service is and the decisions we need to build it up front, so that once we're done with that, it allows our development teams to just go build. And there's nothing worse for development teams, in my opinion, for them to believe this is the product, and then to get way down the road and then have people flip it around on them. It's very demoralizing. It resets the clock. There's a lot of wasted time. If you can get that input up front, you can actually just deliver much more quickly. And when we first started to employ that in AWS, a lot of the teams hated it because it was a relatively new concept at Amazon at that time. And I had worked on it a lot with Jeff when I was working as a shadow. And we make them go through it 3, 4, 5 times. It's taking so much time. It's slowing us down. We just want to start building. Can't we do the prototype? And we were really vigilant about it. And what we found was that it actually allowed us to move much faster. Because the few services that got built around the company at that time that didn't go through that process had huge resets halfway through, and they ended up shipping much slower. So that also allowed us, we could take that press release and FAQ out to internal customers and to the external customers we trusted and said, what do you think? And that gave them, it was more than just a high-level PowerPoint. It was really detailed, and they could tell us exactly what resonated and what didn't, and which features mattered and which didn't, because we had to make decisions on what would be in V1 and what didn't. So now the go-to-market question.
Well, actually, let me pause you there, because you just said something there that, to my mind, was really excellent and very different to hear how we hear many startups start. I mean, there's so much emphasis on create a minimum viable product and develop this set of capabilities, et cetera, and there's not enough emphasis on exactly where you started, which is where most people come to be challenged. And that is, you right away said, well, wait a second, let's just write what our messaging and positioning is going to be and validate up front what is the roadmap that we're going to have to deliver on before we even write anything. And as you said, you've proven it. When that happens, every engineer who makes 1,000 decisions below the radar can get on with a very clear roadmap and be productive. And at the end of it, you're going to be able to engage a marketplace.
You hope.
You hope. Well, but at least you've validated it on the upfront. Whereas, of course, we see way too often, as I was describing earlier on, the product's looking great, but it's in isolation of where it's actually going to have impact and going to get traction.
We got there in part because in the early, I'd say from maybe 97 to maybe 2001 at Amazon, we had some of these ideas that were great high-level ideas, but we get later and later into the product, and we do these reviews, and we'd say, so say again why this is really that meaningful, and you'd hear it, and you'd think, well, I don't know, it doesn't sound that important, that meaningful, and which is terrible for the team to hear.
Absolutely.
And so that's really a lot of the value we get too is that it forces teams to be really crisp about what matters, and it lets us argue about it and lets us keep improving it until we get to a point where we think we have something meaningful.
That's great. So back to the go-to-market.
So how do we form a go-to-market plan? That was an interesting experience too, and I don't know if we would consider ourselves, having done an expert job of it or not, but we had a lot of argument about it, should we should we try and go pursue enterprises or startups or mid-market? Should we, what's the advertising and the broad awareness campaign? And what we ultimately decided when as we were building this press release and FAQ, we felt like we didn't identify it as elegantly as you did on your slide of that MVS.
Yep.
But we felt like we had a product that had an MVS, which was, we really could imagine, the spectrum of startups and enterprises and public sector companies using these services, because they all had those infrastructure needs, and they weren't being particularly well served. And we thought this was a differentiated approach. But we pretty consciously, early on, after we got through those debates, decided that we really wanted to target, to begin with, startups. And the reason was a fewfold. First of all, like one of your CEOs said, the sales cycles on enterprises and public sector are really long. And we started AWS with one salesperson. And so we didn't have salespeople to really spend long cycles on long sales cycles. The second reason is when you're trying to advance a technology that's a pretty disruptive shift, it's very often the smaller companies and the entrepreneurs that adopt it first.
Yeah, the innovators.
Right, and some of it is because their alternatives are not as good as very large capitalized enterprises, but also they just tend to be more entrepreneurial and more lean forward. And we felt like we had this model in our heads that we used to talk about, which was that we wanted a single student in his or her dorm room to have access to the same scalability and the same price or cost structure for infrastructure as the largest enterprises in the world. That's the way we were thinking about it. And we felt like that would be powerful if we could do that. And so that's who we really spent our time trying to attract. And so then we put tactics together and strategies together on how we could reach that group of customers. And some of that, one of the things that we also liked about that group of customers is that they tend to blog a lot. They tend to evangelize for you if they find the product is remarkable. And so we also felt like we had a chance to get a lot of viral marketing, which would be very cost effective, obviously, for a new business like this. And that's what we did. We launched products that we felt like were remarkable and added a lot of value and that were disruptively priced. And that led to a lot of early adoption and excitement and viral marketing that we could never have paid for ourselves. We had a PR strategy. Amazon is fortunate that people are interested in the company.
Yeah,
and
you had a brand.
This seemed like a real departure at the time for Amazon, and so people were very intrigued by this story and wanted to talk to us about it. We hired technology evangelists, and we tried to hire people who were passionate but credible and highly technical, and we really put them on the road. And Jeff Barr, really, Jeff has done an unbelievable job and has been one of the singular voices of AWS, and he really was like a rock star. He's like the Dave Matthews Band traveling around so frequently. And I'd say the same thing for Werner Vogels, who was our CTO. Werner had done so many things at the company, and he was really passionate about the change that AWS could have on the world. And he's on the road 200 plus days a year and evangelizing. So that's also very helpful. We did, and those guys also blog themselves. And then we did a number of startup events. We went to 10, 15 cities, starting in the US and ultimately in other places around the world, where we would do these startup events where we'd have an introduction to AWS, we'd have an evangelist go through the services, and then we'd bring up, often we'd have a VC partner who would talk about something interesting about building a company for startups, and then we would have 4 customers who are actually using AWS in that locale get up and do a panel about their experience and take Q&A. That was always the most compelling part of the day, because startups love to see peers who were,
Yeah.
and so those are some of the things we did early on as we, I think the other thing, we didn't necessarily think of it initially as a marketing strategy, but it turned into one.
Yep.
It didn't turn into a strategy, it just turned into, it's kind of like if you build a remarkable product, you get all this viral marketing. This turned into the same thing where we had a real bias for delivering quickly and iterating quickly and trying to organize ourselves so that we could iterate quickly. And as we kept iterating at a really quick pace, it just, again, it drove a lot of awareness and publicity and attention. And we were doing it and continue to do it because we think that's what our customers want. And they have any number of asks constantly for us, which we dutifully prioritize and then try and crank out for people. But that also created a lot of momentum for us.
That's terrific. And what's interesting is, although you said you didn't pursue this MVS strategy, in fact, you really did. You figured out, what was the set of customers that had similar needs. And interestingly enough, you picked up a point I didn't talk about today, but we do in our class, which is if you can pick a segment that actually is self-referencing, that talk to each other, where when you blog, people refer to it, and they obviously want to be in a peer group where they can say they're doing great things and talk to their peers and say, well, yeah, but have you tried this? Yeah. It becomes viral, and it develops its own momentum.
Yeah. And if you don't you have to be careful too, because there are all these segments, like you were talking about in your slide, where if you try to build the product to appeal to them right away, there's just all these things you have to build that
pulled apart.
Yeah, it would have made it hard for us to launch quickly.
Yeah, so that's one of the hardest things for people to hear, but actually you just have to resist that temptation, because it's very easy to say, well, there's another customer here. They want to write us a check, and the next thing you know.
Well, we had this strategy which sounded good, but wouldn't have been successful if we hadn't been able to execute on it, which was that we were going to build, we were going to pick a line to draw for V1.
Yep.
And which, by the way, that is some of the hardest set of decisions I feel like we make. And sometimes we get it right and sometimes we don't get it right. But and then that set of functionality had to be outstanding. It really had to work, and it had to be a set that was meaningful enough that would be relevant and powerful in the market. But then we were going to iterate quickly after we heard what customers found was next most important. And that strategy sounds good, but if you don't execute, you actually just have a primitive product. I mean, when we launched EC2, there was no persistent storage, there was no monitoring, there was no auto scaling, there was no load balancing, there was no Windows, there were no multiple availabilities. I mean, it just didn't have any of the features. It was really primitive. And if we hadn't been able to iterate quickly, it just would have been kind of an interesting toy, but not a product that people would build businesses on top of.
That's so well said. You also said something interesting, though, that I think we shouldn't miss, which is you actually were applying an agile methodology even to your marketing. It sounded like you had a very quick feedback loop going there too. So even as you went to market, you were learning and figuring out how to move things forward and take best practices and spin them for the next iteration of things.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the last part, and then a wrap to bring up our cloud hatching companies here, which is, what was the business model that you picked? Because that can't have been easy either. I mean, there was no such thing as a pricing mechanism, unless you go back to IBM mainframe days and think about code sharing and those kinds of approaches. So how did you think about that?
It's a good question. And when we wrote the original business plan for AWS, and actually when we wrote the vision document, which was the first narrative we wrote on it, it didn't have a financial model, which is unusual. We were trying to get a concept that we thought people would get behind. And some people very appropriately said, well, this is really interesting, Andy, but there's no financial model in here. I don't know how you react to that type of idea.
Let's not go there. And actually, we usually don't see financial models in these early stage companies. That's the last thing they know how to do.
And what I said was, I can go up to the whiteboard and there's 4 or 5 levers that, depending on what you believe, I can show you how this can be $1 million business or a $10 billion business. And I really truly don't know the answer to what to project. And we had gone through a lot of these processes at Amazon. We used to have this process in the early days that we called NPI. I think it stood for New Product Introduction. And if you had a project that required resources from multiple development teams, you'd have to go present your idea to this NPI committee. And it was all the leaders of each of these teams. And it was painful. This cabal was was demanding and tough, and you'd have to project what the NPV would be. And what we found over time was that these projections were always wrong, always.
Meaningless.
And because it's just so hard to predict. And so we would trick ourselves at ideas that seemed really compelling, but the person had been conservative on the NPV projection. And we'd fund ideas that seemed, interesting, but maybe not groundbreaking, where the person was aggressive, and you get the opposite result. So we came to believe, you had to believe it could be a big business if you were successful.
Yep.
And so we funded AWS without, really a fully vetted financial model where we said it was going to be X size. We just felt like it could be really meaningful and a big long-term business for Amazon. But then we had to figure out how to price it. And to do pricing, you have to understand what your costs are, and you have to understand what the competitive landscape is for alternatives for your product. And you have to decide whether you're trying to build a high margin business or a low margin business that does volume.
And you picked that strategy very early.
We did. Amazon doesn't really have high margin businesses.
Right.
They really, almost all the businesses we pursue are high volume, low margin businesses, and we. I don't know what's right or wrong. Different companies have philosophies, but we have always been more.
But it's consistent. That's one of the important things.
We've been more excited about more absolute margin dollars than the margin percentage.
Yeah.
And we always we're trying to build businesses that help the largest number of customers, and you can be relevant to more customers if your price is lower than if it's higher.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we kind of knew those things, and then we looked at the first set of financial modeling we did. And it was a little daunting because the business that AWS is really capital intensive. And you have to build out these, one of the advantages for our customers is that they don't have to lay out the capital. They get to, pay a variable expense, but we have to lay out that capital. And we have to build a lot of data centers and buy a lot of hardware and a lot of networking gear in advance of being able to monetize it. And so that was a little scary when we were looking at that. And again, we just had this long-term vision that if we were successful, what you see is that it's a good business over time. You just have to do a lot of volume to be successful. And so taking that long-term approach, we didn't try and break even on the infrastructure investments, the capital infrastructure investments too early.
Right.
And that was a really important decision because it's a new business. There's a number of people internally that feel like this is really different from the rest of Amazon. Does this really make sense? And you want to actually show success really, as quickly as possible, and you want to break even. You don't want to hurt the company. All those things. And yet, if we had priced it too high, I think we wouldn't have had nearly the amount of adoption and virality that we had. And so, we decided that we were going to think about this long term. And then we decided that we would price it on a variable pay for what you consume basis. And that really came out of, we just heard so often how much people hated the breakage model and the commitment model, especially when they weren't sure if they needed that resource for that long, that we thought about it as, well, why don't we just have people pay for whatever they consume? And there's some people who say, look, I'm willing to make some commitment to you if I can pay less, and that's also fine. And we have pricing constructs like that as well, but it's not, it's not what we led with. And so that's how we thought about it. We believed that we would have a sales and marketing team, even though it was tiny when we started, but we always envisioned that it would be smaller than what the large technology companies have, and we'll see over time if we're successfully able to implement that. But we felt like if you were a new shift in a model allows you to try to reinvent the way certain functions operate, and we didn't want to spend 25 to 50% on sales and marketing.
Right.
And
you couldn't
so,
afford it, probably.
Well, we couldn't afford it. We definitely couldn't afford it then, and we also just think we want to take all of our. We want our cost structure to be such that we can keep providing lower prices to customers. That's our strategy. In the history of Amazon, it's only recent that we've done any TV advertising for the Kindle business, and we have always felt like the best marketing dollars we can spend is continuing to lower prices for customers.
What's interesting about listening to you is a couple of things that we talk about in the class, so I just want to draw them out. I mean, one is that you didn't have a financial model, and I often say this to entrepreneurs, we don't expect you to. It's very hard for anybody to come back and develop a 5-year plan when they haven't even got their first customer. I mean, let's be realistic. It's just, we're not going to do that. And also, you're making a breakthrough by definition if you're doing something truly disruptive. So there is no model for what you're going to do. Otherwise, you wouldn't be innovating. And so we're always okay with that. Part of the point, though, is that you had some very clear assumptions. And one of them I think that was very important that you highlighted here is you knew this could be a very big business. So it's one of the things I try to encourage you as entrepreneurs to think about is how can you explain how this can be a big business? How can the disruption end up generating a significant amount of value for your customers that ultimately you can translate into a business model for yourself? Yeah. And it seemed like you had a clear vision on that and you were very specific about it. So I think that's one of the things that hopefully, as you get a chance to talk to Andy, I'd encourage the team to look around and think about, well, what is it that you could do to evaluate that early on and then test it early on? But I want to underline one last piece of this, which I brought up in the slides, is we don't expect you to have all the answers. I mean, that's not realistic. If you come with one standout thing, which in this case was this just clear and compelling vision that elastic cloud-based compute was obviously going to be a big opportunity, everything else can be worked around that. So, so thanks for sharing that. Yep. Well, I think this is an appropriate point to say a very big thank you to Andy for not only sharing the AWS vision and what he's achieved in 7 years with his team and with the Amazon support, but also for exposing it here to all of us and for us learning. I've learned a lot today, and so thanks very much, Andy. And we're going to take a short break now and then come back and group with our cloud hatching people. But thank you, Andy, very much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.